Okay, so I have about 3 minutes past the hour, so we're going to start. We're now going to be beginning module 5 in 2 parts. We're going to have module 5A, which is about patronage and ethnic identity, what role it plays in the identity of God's people, but also patronage is probably one of the most important topics that we'll be engaging with for New Testament theology, because the entire Roman Empire was based on the patronage system. The empire would completely collapse if it wasn't for patronage. And I think some of the issues that are involved theologically is as we go into a section that introduces ecclesiology, what the church should be, the church is going to operate on a relational level that is very different from what patronage is. And part of the problem of what the church has to do is disciple especially Gentile congregations, out of what they grew up in. And that's really hard. And it poses a particular pastoral challenge, because if you only know how to relate to people one way, and you live that all your life, and then the gospel says, no, we're going to relate to each other a completely different way. We're actually going to flip the paradigm over. That calls for, without one's baptism as a reminder of one's Christian identity, that my old life is dead as I go into the water, and I'm raised to a completely new way of living in Christ. Without that baptismal identity as the first step toward discipleship, and that commitment to live a new life in Christ, the church is dead in the water spiritually, and unable to bear witness to a God who has called us to live quite differently from the rest of the Roman world and in our world today. I think one of the most exciting things of patronage is that if we listen carefully and think theologically about how the patronage system works and what the church was trying to do, we'll see that issues of patronage exist in our time. And I don't know if the church has done a good job in being an alternative community to the patronage systems of our day. And so this is I think, the pastoral challenge. And then with the second group that we'll talk about later, how does culture, ethnicity, family lineage, blood versus the blood of Jesus kind of help us understand who we are as God's people? That's a topic that we'll discuss probably after the break in the second half. So up here is a shameless advertisement about the hope that we'll be able to reconstitute the travel courses. We actually haven't gone to Greece since 2014. We have, however, had 2 trips through Christ the Checkpoint in Israel, especially the area of the Palestinian Authority. But what I would really like to do is actually have a course that's dedicated to the growth and birth of the Jesus movement, early Christianity. And so have an Israel trip, and then after that, a Turkey trip or Asia Minor trip. So I'm hoping that, it was actually we were going to plan on doing this in 2020. Believe it or not, in 2020, we were planning our first Israel trip, but of course, COVID blew up everything. So I was really sad about that. That was probably one thing I was looking forward to the most. But the hope is still alive. We will not give up. Why don't I begin with a word of prayer, and then we'll kind of launch into patronage as a topic, and I'll hand over the microphone to our presenters shortly. But let's pray. Heavenly Father and gracious God, we thank you for this time. Thank you so much for these brothers and sisters in the Lord who have come here to not only study your word, but to take your word and to live it out as fully and as faithfully as possible, and to share that word with those you place under pastoral care. Pray that as we seek to establish a vision of what the church should be, not just this night, but in the weeks ahead, Lord, lay upon our heart a burden, a real spiritual burden for your people, that we will do all that we can, and we will give all that we can, so that your people will be equipped to bear witness to who Jesus is by the way we love one another, and how we relate to each other in a way that in many ways is an antithetical to the world out there. A broken and fallen world needs the hope that the church can embody in the message of Jesus Christ. And so, Lord, we pray that you might speak to us this evening and through our presenters. This we pray in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. All right, just a quick word. So we're going to have an introduction to patronage by Anthony and Allison. this evening. And I just wanted to preface, without putting any pressure on our presenters, that some, and maybe not all the questions that they'll be addressing, but I would like to also have a time of discussion in breakout rooms after the presentation. Is that, what is the patronage system? Who is a patron? Who is a client? Who is a friend? What social level was Paul in the patronage system, or what I call the patronage pyramid? And how did the patronage system affect the ways in which the members of the church related to each other, especially the Church of Corinth? So we had a reading, especially from an essay by Peter Lampe, who's a German New Testament scholar. This topic, entire volumes of books have been devoted to it. So the beauty of the article that you read for tonight's reading is that it's one of the best distillations, like in a nutshell, approach to what the patronage system works. Otherwise, you'd have to read several books to really grasp your head around it. And I'm really grateful that he did not shy away from showing where in the New Testament issue of patronage is partially addressed. So without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing. And now I'm going to hand over the microphone to our presenters.
There's a big button on the top right that says present, Anthony. Got you. Does it still say it's loading for you, Anthony? Because it does for me. You're also muted.
Oh, this is so smooth, you guys. Oh my gosh. Can you guys believe just how smooth this is right now?
There's going to be a few jokes in here. Just be ready. They're great.
How's that?
There it is. Beautiful. So, hey, everyone. We're going to be talking about Paul, Patrons, and Clients, written by Peter Lampe. Anthony and I will hopefully translate this into be a little bit more tangible and applicable into our context today. This conversation is super important because this is the lived reality of the citizens within the Roman Empire. So this is the system that Jesus and the disciples, and specifically Paul in this conversation, are up against. Paul and Jesus and all of the cool kids were going against the man, trying to instill this new system of generosity and grace and service. And that directly contradicted the old paradigm of this patron-client relationship. So we're going to go through some key terms just to make sure that you're on the same page as us. So at the bottom of the brackets, we have the freed slaves. So this isn't what you think it is, because the slaves in this era quite possibly could have been paid employees almost, or people who owed a debt to a master. So after they paid off that debt, they still, though, lived in a lifelong relationship with their master as a client. So the master is the patron, the freed slave is the client, and they're still in a symbiotic relationship under this very concrete hierarchy. So the freed slave owes their respect to the patron as the client, and the patron helped with their livelihood. The client then is a freed slave or a freeborn person, and the freeborn person willingly entered the relationship of dependency with the patron. Also a person who would show respect and gratitude and render services to the patron. And this person would very much strengthen the social prestige and the political goals of the patron. If you're kind of thinking of like a landlordship, there would be land involved where the client could work the land that the patron owned. It was a voluntary but contract-based relationship. Another noteworthy thing to recognize is that clients are not necessarily individual people, but groups of people too. It could be an entire household or groups of households. It could be a small city owing their clientage to their patron. This relationship made life more livable for the clients and the patron appear more powerful. And the patron often paid the clients for their good relationship to them. So then the patron in this next bracket, the top of the tier, is anyone who is a powerful or wealthy Roman person or family. Their social status was reflected by the size of the following that they had, their clientele, you could say. And like, these are droves of people. These are, again, entire communities of people who are in relationship with the patron. The patron would often save their clients from starvation and unemployment. During the imperial era that we're under in the Roman Empire, this is the social structure. But after that relationship transitioned from a political structure, it faded into more of a social one. So it was still just the day-to-day lived by reality, and just goes to show how deeply embedded this system was, even after the political gain was not necessarily the main goal. So at the very, very top of the structure, then we have the emperor. This is like the patron. So everyone in the empire was in a patronal relationship to him. It involved everyone from freed persons, the plebs, the soldiers and armies of fleets, and local members of the elite in provinces. A couple other key terms that we're going to need to know in this conversation is the vertical and horizontal movements on the social ladder. So in a vertical relationship, you're looking to the persons above and below you in the social hierarchy for favor and service. Horizontally means that you're looking to your left and your right for your social classes to find your identity there. What's radical about these two terms is that when Paul and Jesus enter the scene, they're trying to invoke a symmetrical model in a way, where he's asking all Christians for mutual respect and mutual love. And that is not about hierarchy, but about community. So understanding these key terms is going to be really important, because Anthony is going to lead us on a hyperspeed adventure in what a lived reality would look like in the Roman Empire.
Can everyone see my beautiful face on the screen? Cool.
Hey, let's talk about patronage for a couple minutes. In our modern society, we tend to find our social identity in horizontal relationships, meaning if you are a member of the poor class, you look left and look right and identify and find your place socially within the horizontal grouping of poor. Same with middle class or any other class. If you are a middle class person, you generally look left and look right and identify yourself and your place socially within the middle class rank in society, if you will. We are talking about patronage, and in the patronage system, social identities are generally constructed vertically, not horizontally. So the lowest single unit within society was the family structure, the household. And if you were the head of the household, either as a man or as a single woman, if you were the head of that household, all of the dependents in your household owed you reverence and loyalty. In return, you, as the head of the household, were expected to love and provide for all of your dependents. This same structure was then scaled across the entire system, all the way up to Caesar himself at the top. Caesar was known as the father of Rome. And so all in Rome owed him their fidelity and their praise. And he, in return, was supposed to take care of them and support them. So from the family structure, we could go up to like a city structure. So cities would have patrons. Maybe some cities would have several patrons. They would support their patrons in their political aspirations, in their business dealings. In some cases, clients would follow around behind their patrons, just cheer them on, just talk about how great, hey, everybody, come see how great this guy is. Come take a look, it's going to be awesome. Yeah, he's amazing. Check out all the things he's going to do. He's great. And then when they would be making public declarations, if your client and your patron was out speaking in public, the expectation is when they were done, you would clap. You didn't. Whether you supported their actual stance or not was very unimportant, because you were their client and they are your patron. Your role, your duty in society is to support them. So then in return, let's say your city had a patron. If you are the patron of a city, it's your job to take on building projects and to support that city. Let's say they had a natural disaster, like an earthquake, all the way up and down the system, right? If there's an earthquake somewhere in Rome, it is the job of Caesar to make sure that resources get sent to where they are needed, because he's the father of Rome. He is the highest level of patron. and all beneath are his client. And all the way down, if you're the patron of one of the cities that was destroyed, you would use your personal wealth to rebuild that city. And in return, your honor, your glory, your dignitas would increase. And so as the city that you are the patron of would flourish and grow, they might put up a statue of you and your dignitas would grow. And then you would pay for a beautiful library to be put into that town. And then your dignitas would grow. And then more would desire to become your clients. And the more clients you have, the more your dignitas would increase. And the system of give and take in society where you are trying to get as much social capital as you possibly can. Let's take a look at how this plays out. So if Tony is a poor person and he is a client of the patron, Miguel, then Tony would relate himself socially, would find his identity more as a client of Miguel's than as a friend of the poor person or as someone on a peer relationship with another poor person next to him. So in this case, because Tony and Tanya and Jim all are clients of the patron Miguel, Jim, Tanya, and Tony, although they are in different horizontal classes in society, would actually find their identification as the same because they are all clients of Miguel, and that is where they would find their social identity. As you start to draw the connections between the various clients and patrons, you begin to see that it becomes this sort of messy web very quickly, because these aren't one-to-one. It's not that Tony is a client to the patron Miguel, and that is his sole connection. Tony very likely is a client of Miguel, a client of Bryce here, a client maybe of Tanya right here also. And so multiple clients can serve a single patron. Clients can serve multiple patrons. So why would someone choose to become a client of a patron? The simple answer is access to resources. These resources could be money, could be land, but they could also be social resources, access to people, and access to a higher level of prestige within the community. Let's say Tony down here makes shoes for a living, and he's been importing his leather from someplace out of town, and the prices just keep going up, and it's getting ridiculous, and he's going to go out of business and be without a job if he doesn't get some leather at a better price. So because Tony is a client of Miguel's, he's going to go to Miguel and say, Miguel, I know that you have a relationship with Max. I know you are one of Max's clients. And we all know that Max has a monopoly on leather. And so what I'm hoping you'll do is that you'll go talk to Max and that he will agree to then sell me leather at a more reasonable price so that I can continue to make the shoes. And Max, being a benevolent patron that we all know that he is, will say, of course, Miguel, of course I will help your client, Tony, to get access to less expensive leather. And Miguel has now strengthened his relationship with Max. And Max has strengthened his relationship with Miguel, and Miguel has strengthened his relationship with Tony. And so Tony is going to want to sing the praises of Miguel all the more. Oh, my business was going out, and then he came in and he saved me. Oh, this Miguel, he's incredible. And then Miguel is, of course, whenever Max is around, he's going to be like, oh, everybody, you need to know this guy Max. He's absolutely amazing. His generosity knows no bounds. Did you buy any of those great shoes from Tony? Yeah, let me tell you, that is only made possible because my man Max and his generosity. And what was it that held this complex web of interconnections? What held it together? Now, if you were a former slave, if you were a freed slave, there were legal requirements for you to be a client of your former slave master. That was a legally defined relationship. But for all others, it was primarily a social honor code that held the entire thing together, especially as time went on. In the earliest versions of the patronage system, it was more about the way a patron would exercise authority or held authority over their clients. But as the system developed, it developed into a system that was more about mutual support and honor than it was hierarchy and authority. An easiness aspect of the system is that it's primarily generational, meaning that if Tony was a client of the patron Miguel, by default, Tony's children would become clients of Miguel. And this can go on for generations and generations. Miguel's heir would be the patron to Tony's heirs, on and on and on, as long as the system could be maintained. And so you can see that very quickly, within a few generations, Miguel's family has suddenly gathered an army of clients. And if on top of that, right, it's not just that it was Tony as Miguel's client, but Miguel had all of these other clients. And then on through the generation, these webs grow more interconnected and wider and deeper to where power becomes centralized in just a few families. So this vertical alignment of patronage with Caesar on top has a very obvious conflict with Christianity. Christianity had its own vertical hierarchy, its own vertical structure with God the Father on top, who sustains and loves and cares for all of his children. We owe God our fidelity and praise. You see, both systems required exclusive devotion. The parallels in these two systems were incredibly obvious to the early Christians. And they were so obvious that the book of Revelation actually references Rome's hierarchy as a false demonic version of the relationship between God and his church. You can see then that an entire society, right, Rome being built on this hierarchy, could not allow for a parallel hierarchy that Christianity represented.
I can't see it. I don't know if y'all can.
Oh no. Can everyone see it? Oh no. Green.
We'll get there.
Share this one. Share. Nope. Yes.
Well, this time it's a white. Oh, there it is. Perfect. There it went.
Oh, sorry.
Awesome.
Hopefully it was fast enough for you.
It was awesome. Thank you for that, Anthony. The visuals were superb. The drawings, obviously Rembrandt reminiscent. So some takeaways, some positives and maybe not so positives about the article and the contents thereof. Some strengths would be that this article and this description of the structure allows the reader to see how fully the citizens of Rome were embedded and immersed in this patron-client structure. This is what they lived and breathed. Something I appreciated about Lampa is that he specifically highlighted the role of women in the structure. So there was a reference to Phoebe, for example, and her relationship to Paul, being a patron to him, supporting the church. The writing style just was really easy to follow, I thought anyway, in comparison to some of the more Greek to me ones that we've had, which are still very illuminating, but a little bit more complex. Some things that we thought that could be a little bit stronger, further emphasized, is that while, again, this is an article that has a point to prove, it was a little bit, we wondered if this was dramatized in a sense of like, is the patron-client system really the one that was what people were adhering to, or was this just imperialism at play? Or is the patron-client relationship another way to describe how imperialism played out in the Roman context? Because this, in a way, the client-patron system sounds pretty buddy-buddy, like, hey, this is a favor I'll do for you if you do this for me. But really, if this is imperialism at play, like, you have no choice in the system. Like, this is about survival, life and death, like your struggle to put food on the table, to have employment, and to have protection in your city where you're living. Something that was a little unclear was about those two systems and their relationship to each other, which is part of the conversation that we're having, is the Roman patron-client system and the Christian system. And for the people in that context, what did it mean to be a Christian, but also a citizen of Rome? And I mean, Jesus himself addressed that issue in like, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and render to God what is God's. But still, how do you do that? And then with the roles that you then have with the people in your context who are also Christians, what is your relationship to them? Like, how do you give that mutual love, that mutual respect to each other as a brother and sister in that mutual relationship, when in your lived reality, there's still these hierarchies at play? And again, like, not everyone has the status of Paul or a disciple as a teacher. There is still like, the blurred lines are just a little complicated, and I feel like they could have had some ironing out. Another question that we walked away with was, what did the relationship look like in seeking the patron-client structure? Was it a client that would go to a patron and being like, hey, like, I would like your support? Or was it the patron saying, hey, friend, I want you to support me? Like, who is the initiator or instigator in that? So then we will end with some ministry applications or implications. This one, I mean, our modern context is completely different. If we don't understand the patronage system in Rome, we're going to be missing the depth and the meaning of what Jesus and Paul were addressing in their time teaching. The questions of where is your loyalty and who are you serving, those are lived reality questions. So when Jesus makes those comments of give to Caesar what is Caesar's and give to God's what is God's, like, this is a radical request of people denying the lived reality that they are in to follow what God is doing in God's kingdom. It's also important to note that Jesus related himself to the lowest bracket in the structure. And we can see that in scripture based on what he's doing. Like, he's kneeling and washing the feet of disciples. That isn't something that a patron would do. The language also matters. Paul, when he's writing, is taking down a system. When he's talking about, like, don't be a slave to society or a servant or a steward to this society, but rather be a steward to Christ and God alone. that completely changes the emphasis in a way that we would not have otherwise known if we did not know about the patron-client relationship. Anthony, you had us going in the hyperspeed video, but did you have any other thoughts that you wanted to throw into this section?
Yeah, I couldn't help but think about the historical Paul project, right? And like, really the question it came down to at the end, like for me morally, was, did I believe that Paul was working within the patronage system and that what he was doing was related to that? Or did I think that he was trying to establish a new economy and a new way based on Jesus's teaching? I happen to fall on the later one, but I felt like the video that we watched fell on this side. And so for me, it was cool to see the deep connection between the two.
Awesome. So with all that, we hope that this presentation on the article from Peter Lampa illumined your perspective on the patron-client influence in scripture, and that these insights will not be couched.
Right. Excellent. Really good job. Wow, I think you raised the bar on the presentations. Now everyone's sweating bullets in your class, in the class. Okay. All right. Excellent. I really appreciated it. See that you sped up the video to make sure that you weren't too much over time. So
to max speed.
Max. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. And I didn't know that I had a future in the leather industry, but I'll keep that in mind. So excellent work. I thought it's actually quite superb. So thank you very much for the presentation. Really enjoyed it. I would like to follow up by maybe just start off with any questions that the class has for our presenters. And then we are going to have a time where we can break up and talk about this a little bit more. I do think that the presenters rightly highlighted that what Lampa did was try to show some parallels where the early Christian church kind of mirrored in a certain way the patronage system. But what I would like to suggest, which is where my critique of Lampa would be, an otherwise excellent description of how patronage works, is that I do think Paul and Jesus tried to flip the paradigm upside down. So they were thinking of the church as an alternative way to relate to another, that in many ways would have threatened the Roman Empire, because had if this is what Christianity is about in terms of what the church should be, then it would completely undermine what patronage is. And I think that conversation is worth discussing. And there's the entry points for that in the New Testament is where, especially in the Corinthian church, the Corinthians are acting as if they're still in the patron-client relationship. Some of this was highlighted or hinted at in the Lampa reading, and there's others that he didn't mention that I'll highlight as we go on later on this evening together. But Paul seems to have found the introduction of patronage, for the most part, problematic when it's inserted into the church. Although the church had its patrons in a good way, where people who were of influence hosted, for example, the house church meetings. It was in their homes because slaves or free people wouldn't have places that could accommodate the house church. So you needed to rely on, to a certain degree, some patrons in the church. But really, even though socially they were patrons, what was their role within the church? How is leadership really defined? So these are some of the questions I think are very much worth breakout rooms for. But before we go there, just really quickly, any quick questions about just the presentation itself, points of clarification, expansion that you want to ask directly of Anthony and Allison? Okay, I mean, I think their presentation was in a very good way, stunningly clear. So maybe people don't have questions. Okay, then what we'll do is this. We're just break out into the breakout rooms. So just rehearse what you heard from Anthony and Allison. What's a patron? What's a client? How do they relate to each other? And then where do you think that intersects with the New Testament? Where do you see patron-client system at work? What is the New Testament evaluation of the system? And what points of contrast do you think the church doesn't act like a patronage client system? You know, in what ways is it different? And here's the tough question, pastorally, what does that mean for us today? Some joke that it's the modern version of mafia. I like to think of our alderman system in Chicago as something like a patron system of a sort. But really sometimes we network, quote unquote network, among churches. And in a celebrity pastor culture, I don't see much difference sometimes in how church leaders relate to each other as patient and clients, and it becomes really problematic. So let's break up into different. So I'm gonna let's say stop sharing the screen here. We're on stop sharing. Okay, great. And then breakout rooms. How many people we have? Okay, 16. So that makes for a group of 4. No, 5. 5 would be 1. Oh, yeah, that's better. Okay. Create. Okay, so everyone has 3 except one group I think has 4, and I'll be visiting you. So go ahead and answer those questions. 10 minutes. 10 minutes. Okay, I got my clock right. Okay, there we go. Please join the chat.
Speak, Rachel?
Yes.
We're gonna have to up our game, huh?
Right? Definitely.
You know, it is baptism, so maybe we could perform a baptism via Zoom.
Oh,
know.
that'd be something. Okay.
I'm trying to figure out how we can up our game, you know.
Yeah. But they did an excellent job. I mean,
Yeah.
I really can follow the information was good. They took a complex topic and they broke it down very, very clearly. So really appreciate what they did. No pressure though. I mean, you know, that everyone has their different ways of presenting I've seen a lot of good work. So anyway, I don't want to lead our discussion, but you know, should we kind of ask about how patrons and clients relate to each other? I mean, what do you think? Why do you think the system worked? And maybe, you know, what's dangerous about the system, do you think? And then would you feel comfortable if the church related to each other the same way as patron and clients do in the Roman world? I mean, you know, what do you think Paul was trying to do with the churches? I do think it's really telling that out of all the social levels on the patronage pyramid, with the emperor on top and different levels like merchants, soldiers, senators above that, you know, then you have municipalities or city officials, which are at a lower level than say a Roman senator would be, artisans who work with their hands. You know, you just kind of go down the ladder. The lowest is the slave, and yet Paul and Jesus both identify themselves with slavery. Paul says he's a slave servant of Christ. Paul says, you know, I didn't come to be served. I came to serve and be a ransom for many. So Jesus himself also identified himself at the bottom of the patronage. But what does that mean? That the Christian would actually identify themselves not at the higher end of the patronage period, but at the bottom. So these are some things to really kind of consider. So, but thoughts, the comments on the presentation? You know, I mean, the patronage system worked for a millennia. That's how powerful it was. The Roman Empire was one of, I mean, if you broaden world history, you know, China stumps the legacy of the Roman Empire and its dynasties. But really in the Western world, what civilization lasted for over a millennia? And so it worked. And any thoughts on why do you think it was a successful system, and what were some of, if you played the system well, what do you think some of the advantages were?
It's a curious thing, Max. I'm just thinking, like, because they identified themselves more, it said that more than identifying with their own social class, they identified more with their, I'm going to call it family, their people, their patronage group.
Yeah.
and it's interesting. I live in Minneapolis, and one of the things that they have wanted to do is to put in low income housing in the midst of wealthier neighbors, to integrate different social classes into a same neighborhood instead of having such segregated economic neighbors. It's just making me curious. It's a curious thing to think about. It's the people, that's who you most identify with, not the class that you're a part of. I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, if you think about it, it makes sense, because the Roman Empire doesn't want people of the same social class, especially the slave class, interacting with each other. Otherwise, you might get rebellion. So you have to. So the higher up you go, the less you want people of a lower social status to cooperate with each other. You did get some of that, though. I mean, some of one of the biggest economic renovations of the early Roman Empire, it was the idea of trade associations where merchants banded together. So that's an example where it's a little bit of an outlier of the patronage system. Merchants gathering together for trade associations to help one another in each other's commerce.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like you see like parts of our system today, like networking, like kind of like seem to kind of fit in, like it's who you know, and it's the favors they can call in for you and what you can do for them. I was thinking about the parallel in churches of like the kind of the dark side of this system of like when you get that wealthier person that gives money to the church, but then thinks they own the church. Whether it's like how that money is spent, or like, well, then I get to pick the color that goes on the wall, or I get to pick how the ministry goes, because they're not really able to give it freely. They're giving with kind of that expectation of essentially like being a patron. And so I think it's like there were elements that they needed, like a place to host their gatherings and these other things, but then it was so radical to then kind of like lay that aside and be mutually equal. Like, it's just hard to imagine how they kind of held those things together, or like to have that script flipped. I don't know. It's crazy.
I think, definitely it could be really dangerous that if churches, Paul seemed to have the same problem. This is jumping ahead a little bit, but one New Testament scholar, a person named Chow, wrote a book on patronage and Paul, and he suspected that one of the reasons why the brother who was married not to his biological mother, but the wife of his father, that was engaged in some sort of wrong relationship with them, that the church was reticent about rebuking the person because he might have been a patron, a person of wealth. Because usually if you're talking about wives or this kind of where, you're interested in the wife of your father who's a spouse but not biologically related, that happens in kind of affluent households, not necessarily among the poor. So the church faced that issue. Paul himself said that he didn't want the Corinthian church to be a patronage group for him, because they were immature. You don't have much. He received support from Philippi because that was a mature church. But with Corinth, I'm going to give the gospel free of charge. I'm going to work it as a tent maker. And then that made things worse, because where's the tent making scheme on the patronage pyramid? People who work with their hands are just above slaves. You don't, that's kind of a, that's a dingy, back-breaking, bone-crunching work that you're doing. And a leader should not have to do things like that. So you do see the friction between the two systems.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Other thoughts?
It's interesting what you just said, because you see Paul saying, I'm a Roman citizen, so I deserve to be treated like a Roman citizen.
Yep.
So there's like that piece. And then what you said, him being at this level of a slave, and how different that is. I don't know. I feel like it's different in our culture. And
well, he was smart. This is a great example. When it came to outsiders outside the church, he leveraged patronage to his advantage for the gospel. It wasn't for himself, but he didn't want the gospel to be stopped. So he leveraged his Roman citizenship. But what about in the church? Did he leverage it?
Mm.
Yeah.
I mean, what's interesting is his letter to Philemon. He says, in the church, I could leverage my authority to tell you to release Onesimus, but I'd rather you make your own choice. Do you see some of the things there? So I think Paul really wanted the church to be something different, but he wasn't afraid in the sharing of the mission of the gospel to leverage patronage. I think he would do it in a way that didn't exploit people, but never, maybe it was more like a defensive move. When the empire was gonna try to shut down what he was doing, he said, I'm a Roman citizen. And then and he used that to open doors.
Mhm.
Yeah. That
Yeah, and
makes
I would
a lot of sense.
imagine, oh, sorry. I was saying, I would imagine the system really depended on what kind of patron you had.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, you
I'm
could have
sure
a
there were good and
tyrant.
bad ones.
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
I mean,
So it's like, that can really make or break just like what your lived experience is as a client, whether you had a good patron or not.
and I think one thing that's left out is what happens in colonization. We'll talk about this a little bit more, but when the Roman Empire colonizes a region, they take a section of the population, they turn them into slave labor, and you could luck out or call it providential that you don't land in the mines of Rome, where the lifespan would only be 3 years before you worked yourself to death, or you ended up in a domestic household and served your years there. And that's probably what happened with Paul. I mean, he has a Roman name. Where does a Pharisee get a name like Paulus? Probably because his grandfather or father was brought to Rome when Rome invaded Israel and conquered the area. And then they were set free, and then they resettled in a Roman colony called in Tarsus. And from that point on, Paul was born with 2 names, Saul and Paul, and he never used the Paul one until he became a Christian, a Gentile apostle. But that's an aside. But you can see how, what I'm trying to say is that the patronage system is in the background. There's a few places where it just kind of rises to the surface because of a major pastoral issue in the letters of Paul, but and also other letters. But most of the time it's in the background, and without knowing that background, we might read into the Jerusalem collection, the idea of a democratic capitalist system that we're living in, and it's not like that.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's quite unusual that Paul, if he was the leader or patron of the churches, really wanted the clients to volunteer, or the churches to volunteer for the love offering, rather than making an edict and command it. It was a voluntary offering. Whereas if you're a patron, you just demanded loyalty of your clients, and there's not much negotiation. Wonderful time with this room. I'm going to try to quickly visit another one, so I'll let you keep talking.
It's so tricky, but I think you have to figure that out. And at some point you're going to have to make a decision of, are you going to maintain your integrity, or are you going to not maintain your integrity?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, I think also, trying to correct what is valorized, or clarify that. Correct might be too strong of a word, but just always clarify it. This is what honors God, that we can understand, and especially right now when they're siloing on political realms, and how do we do that third option and call people to honor Jesus, and be his ambassadors. And so that's not popular. I mean, we've lost donors over just words my wife and I have said, in the last the guy who led me to Christ,
Yeah.
really disappointed with the direction he claimed I was ministering. Yeah.
So you're talking about congregants acting almost like patrons.
Yeah.
And the leverage they have because of the material support that they bring to the church. Yeah, that's a real issue. And it's with that in Paul. I mean, I mentioned with the other group, but a person named John Chow wrote a book called Paul and Patronage. It's excellent work. And he suspects that the sinning brother that the Corinthian church failed to discipline because he was engaged in some sort of physical relationship with not his biological mother, but the wife of his father, that they were reticent to discipline him because he was a patron. I mean, he was a person of wealth. Otherwise, this kind of issue usually doesn't happen among the poor, wanting the wife of your father, meaning that he probably had more than one wife. So that's usually a problem that the affluent have in Roman society. So that's real. Paul said that to the Corinthian church, you guys are a little bit immature, so no, I'm not going to receive any material wealth. I'm going to be a tent maker. And that really angered the Corinthian church. That produced a lot of friction. So Paul understands. He had to deal with it himself. So good. All right, I think a lot of good discussion. I hate to interrupt it, but I'm going to actually leave and then people come back to the main session. So,
Sounds
all right.
good. Thanks, Max.
Thank
for
you.
letting everybody learn.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
You
I
just
think
wanted to follow Max.
Just
everyone
like
has
old
22
times.
seconds before they're manually booted out. So, but the group I was listening to, people were really engaged. I think it's a great topic.
Yeah, it is. It's a pertinent conversation, I think.
And I think even another layer, just dealing with teenagers and their own social structures, very complex, and the gospel.
Yeah.
So
Good word.
Agreed.
All right.
Agreed.
So I would love to hear, could you volunteer someone in your group or volunteer yourself what you shared and talked about? Some of you might have just dug into the article deeply. Others thought about the pastoral implications, move there really quickly. But how about Julie, Kathleen, and Rachel? Why don't you share a little bit of what your group talked about? Feel free to volunteer your friend.
Julie can't go because her microphone's not working, but Rachel, do you wanna?
Okay.
Sure, you can fill in if I miss important things, but we talked a little bit about the pastoral implications of experiences where someone wealthy gives a lot to the church that you're serving at, and then they think that they get to pull all the strings or get to pick the color that goes on the wall or the direction of the ministry, and how that's kind of the dark side of this patron-client process. And then we talked about how it would obviously really depend on what kind of patron you had or you were, for what kind of experience you had. If you had a benevolent patron, I think it could be a system that could work really well. But I would imagine that there were probably not, or there were patrons that were not benevolent, that as you amass more power and wealth, that you probably become less kind and caring for your clients. So those were some of the things we talked about.
And sometimes there's favoritism. I mean, that's what the meals are for. If normally you don't eat with your patron because you're in a different social class, but the patron invited you and because you did a particularly good job at the Olympic festival. They needed certain things in place like food. You fell through as a client. You brought in what you could from your business, and you made your patron look good. You might be honored at one of the banquets, and that means someone else is not honored. So yeah. Great. How about Ollie, Michelle, and Praise You Now? Who's that? Could you share from your group? Praise You Now. Who has a Praise You Now email?
That's Mario.
Oh, Mario. Okay, Mario. Okay, great, Mario. So yeah, so please volunteer what your group discussed.
Okay.
Ali, do you want to go?
Okay, yeah, I can go. One of the interesting thing for me was, as Michelle actually shared, like when we discuss, when we consider the 2nd century Christianity, like there has been some like different divisions and bishops, and when we consider the patronage system, it seems to be there are like some strong connection between these divisions and patronage system. And I think that was really helpful for me to understand the 1st century or the 2nd century Christianity. That was my takeaway actually.
Great, great.
I think Michelle, I think Michelle, your question was so important. Like Susan.
Oh, yeah, I was going to ask it before we went to breakouts, but we started. I'm just curious, like if the patronage system had any carryover from the Old Testament system of vassal and suzerain.
I mean, it could be part of the broader cultural matrix of life in the Mediterranean world, but I would say it would be hard to make a direct connection historically.
Yeah, well, and I mean, we discussed some very key differences between the two systems. That the vassal suzerain system seems a little more altruistically motivated, where like a suzerain actually had more pure motivations for caring for a vassal, whereas like the patron client system feels like just a structure of abusive power. Like we likened it to like drug lords with drug dealers,
Okay.
sex trafficking, or I know I threw it in the chat, like multi-level marketing, like I'm trying to collect as many people under me so they make me look good and then I get all the power. And so yeah, we just kind of talked about that, and then some of the ways that can look inside of the church today.
That's an interesting analogy though, social influencing as a patronage model. I believe it. I think that in many ways social media functions to enable patronism at a really larger level. I didn't want to interrupt Mario because I think Mario wanted to say something. So
go for it, Mario.
And then we also spoke about the value of the patronage system.
Okay, good. Yeah.
Because there's also another side of it too. So in terms of being covered and getting the sticking to the core of the message and being able to reap the benefits of what it entails, but at the same token, the negative is that you can't just do what you want to do. So
yeah, I mean, there's a reason why it was successful for over a millennia and it sustained the Roman Empire for over 1,000 years, and that's because if you were a slave and you were set free, so what? What are you going to do? You have no resources, no way to start a business, no capital. So you could, are you facing poverty? Absolutely, unless you become a client of someone. And then that client would give you letters of introduction, would maybe give you one of his businesses to run or fund the next business that you want to do. And then it would benefit the patron because they would get annual percentage of the profits. And then as our presenter shared, if he ever went up for political office, he was guaranteed the vote of his client. No client would vote against their patron. It doesn't matter if the other candidate is better. That's not the issue. My patron is up for election. I'm going to vote for him or her. So there is a real benefit to it. And it was a very successful system, prone to abuse, but very successful.
You're talking max speed because you're actually talking about like have some slaves felt, they're free, but at the same token, what am I going to do now? What am I going to do to eat and all those type of things?
Yeah, because absolutely, because you had nothing. So you in one way, you went from one kind of slavery, which was worse, to a different kind of slavery based on a social patron system. But in many ways, it was an uneven. It wasn't a reciprocal relationship. It was uneven. It definitely benefited the patron more than the client. You're good. I would love to talk more, but I want to hear from other groups. Anthony, Brandy, and Aaron.
Hey guys, I too was voluntold. So we talked.
Okay,
We
that's a new
talked
word for me,
about
voluntold. Okay, all right, that's
yes,
okay.
yes. In our group, we talked a lot about. I asked a lot of questions. That's probably why they made me do this. But just wondering, what does this look like as in the church? What does this look like when the pastor when the congregation wants the pastor to be a patron? What does this look like when the congregation wants the pastor to be at the bottom of the bottom of the bottom of the bottom of clients? And talking through a bit of what that could look like, and where exactly should the pastor find him or herself in this system? What is the ideal place? We talked about that kind of depends on what's happening with the congregation, what type of momentum is there, what type of pastor do they need. We talked about, y'all help me, I'm forgetting all the things. Aaron.
What I would remember. You're good. We talked about some of the stuff that they had talked about before, right, on like what does it look like to have patrons in the church, but then we were talking, we got stuck on like the pastor is as patron or as bottom of the pile client, and what does that look like and how does that play out?
Well, that's a great. I think. Oh, sorry. I just want to add because and we're going to talk about this, but there's a reason there. Jesus and Paul are unanimous in identifying themselves at the bottom of the patron system. So Jesus says, I didn't come to be served. I came to serve and become a ransom of many. So Jesus identified him with the slave. And Paul says, I am a slave or servant of Christ. So what does it mean that that an apostle and then Jesus himself, the founder of the movement, didn't identify themselves at the top, but at the bottom? So I do think there's, Jesus is a king, but he's a king that identifies himself with the slave at the bottom of the patronage pyramid, not at the top. So these are all good questions. So excellent. We're going to pack it a little bit more. Do want to hear from other groups. So Allison, and okay, I know your name isn't Black Barn. Not sure who that is. Sorry. And then also Christina.
Yeah, that's Amy. Sorry, I came in
sorry.
on
Okay.
Work account.
Okay, that's all right. Okay. Want to share a little bit? Yeah.
Yeah, please. A lot of what was said we discussed as well. I think mainly we asked a lot of questions, like what would it look like, because we especially the second question we talked about, the Paul could be argued either top or bottom, but yeah, I think it's interesting that what did we say? What Amy said something about, removing the middlemen in the church. And I said, so basically we're taking the retail stores out of the situation and, we're taking wholesale direct to Christ for that. So, or Christ direct to the buyer. So I think that's what the church, the kingdom really should look like. There's no middlemen. It's just us directly to him.
Okay. Yeah, and there was this idea that the vertical relationship really defined more than the horizontal, but I think in not just inverting the system, but also like reversing it, such that I think maybe the horizontal relationships were not equally or more important than, as the vertical ones. So that was another thought.
Okay, good. All right. I want to hear also lastly from Mike, Natalie, and Phyllis. All good observations and great questions. I don't know if we'll be able to answer all of them, but we're going to try to do some of that good work for the rest of our time together before the break.
We talked much of what everybody else has named, but I think that it's an interesting dynamic because I work at one of our covenant camps and Mike works for Covenant Youth of Alaska. So you bring in some of the like nonprofit and churches kind of being patrons of our nonprofit organizations, and how they, as major donors or supporters of our organizations, carry heavy influence in how that's challenging for our ministries and goes, yeah. So just another layer of it too. Okay,
great. Good. Okay, so all really good questions. I don't know if we're going to answer all of them. We're going to try to answer some of them. What we're going to do now is I do want to fill in some gaps. So while LAMPA is, in my opinion, the best one chapter, one essay, one article summary of how the system works, there's some gaps in it. And I want to make add a little bit more detail that wasn't in the article, and then set us up for a discussion about what the church is trying to do in regards to the patron system. That setup will be explored after our break, but I want to fill in at least the historical detail before we break out. So I'm going, or have a 20-minute break. So let me return to the screen. And then I'm going to show you a picture. All right. So this is what I call the patronage pyramid. And this is just a visual diagram of what the presenters presented orally. But you have Caesar at the top, including the imperial family. And then these constitute different levels of patronage. The senators, they would be the Jeff Bezos, the Microsofts, these incredibly wealthy and politically influential people that entered into the system as a senator, which is outside of the imperial family, was the highest political role in the Roman Empire. Entire provinces or nations were determined by what the senator decided. If you weren't a senator, but of the same social class, you were or the same wealth, you were equestrian. Then you had aristocrats and magistrates. Magistrates would be like local city officials, but not necessarily. And then some of the higher ups might have been officials of a province, more than one city. The equestrians and senators, this is usually in Rome. And then as you step outside of Rome, you can have for the rest, I'm going to write RE, for the rest of the Roman Empire, you can have these other levels. So aristocrats, magistrates is another level. Merchants, soldiers, and artisans. This would be like Lydia, who seemed to have an international trade because she was selling purple wares. So that means she must have got her purple dye from somewhere, which is the most expensive dye in the ancient world, because they didn't really have blue. Blue is really hard. You need manu manufacturing to really get blue. It's more like a purplish blue. The bluer it was, the more important the dye. That's a digression. I don't know why I said that. I think Pliny the Elder was in my head. I'm talking about dyes. But we're talking about like merchants who are really successful, can get raw resources one place, make a product, sell it in major cosmopolitan areas like Corinth or Rome or Philippi. And then we have manual laborers. This is what Paul was doing when he was a tent maker. All right, so he was never a slave. So if you're never a slave, you're a free person, but you might be engaged in manual labor, and that's not good. That's at the bottom. But there is a level that's lower than a free person. That's if you're freed, you got your emancipation as slave, and then slaves. And I understand what Lampa was doing here. Slaves is its own system technically, but the slave, for lack of a word, class or level, I think it's more like patron level. They're not really a class. You need slaves to identify with other slaves as a definable group to think that you're a really class, and that's a little bit not so clear from our resources. But the slaves, they are at the bottom of the patronage pyramid, and Lamba did make rightly that a lot of slaves served in domestic households, like you see in the screen here. So this is a fresco of Roman slaves working in the kitchen. So they're just kind of preparing a meal. So if you lucked out, you had this kind of job. But I want to talk about the back labor. So the scene that was what was not discussed among Lampa, or just mentioned in a few sentences, but glossed over. And that's the kind of manual labor that killed you, that you didn't live more than 3 years if you did it. So how were slaves generated? It's through conquest. The Roman Empire conquered a territory, and they immediately enslaved a segment of their population. If you were capable, educated, likely you ended up in a domestic household here because you're educated, and especially if you spoke Greek well. and then and if you were educated, you could possibly be a tutor for the kids until they went to the gymnasium and had formal schooling. So, but a lot of prisoners of war died in some backbreaking labor. So I just wanted to give you an example of this. So you don't have to read this is recorded in the history of the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides, but I want to kind of show you that you see what these slaves are doing. They're carrying a boat from one part of the land to another because there was no direct way for a boat to reach the other side. So this is this road called Diakolos right here is what these slaves are doing. They put the boat on a wheeled wagon, and these slaves are just pulling the boat so that you can move a boat from here all the way to here or the other way. Otherwise, you'd have to go all around the peninsula, and then you could, if it was a bad storm, you could lose your merchants. And so notice that today there's something called the Corinthian Canal that was dug out in the 1800s that allows a boat to go straight through, but that's 1800s. All right. So, but did you know? So I can show you the picture of it. It's actually pretty cool. So here's the Corinthian Canal today, and literally that thing was just dug across. In Paul's day, you had to carry it across. But did you know that Nero, this is the 1st century AD, tried to cut this canal? He thought that, if we could cut a canal all the way across, then woo, man, that would just increase international commerce. But the problem is he had to stop the project. This is like solid rock. It's not easily cut through. You need modern equipment. So because so many slaves were dying, 6,000 slaves apparently died in an attempt to try to dig this canal. And Nero stopped it, not out of humanitarian reasons, but it was just it was cost inefficient. It was costing him too many slaves. So he stopped the project. But I wanted to mention this example because while we don't have quite the same thing as in the United States today's sad chapter of chattel slavery of African Americans during the Civil War era, that slaves were actually bought and sold like property. Prisoners of war that were enslaved faced extremely harsh conditions that killed them within 1 to 2 years. That's real. And only if you're lucky, you made it, if providentially God allowed you to have a domestic role in a household, could you actually perhaps serve and eventually win the favor of your master and be released. And when you're released, what happens then is you become a freed slave. But then what are you going to do? As Mario points out, you have to become a client. There's really no way to survive without becoming a client of the very master who freed you. So I drew a harsh line here because in this patronage pyramid, you can only be a client at this level. If you are a manual laborer, a freed slave, or a slave, you're a client. That's it. Now, once you get past this level, a merchant could be a patron for manual laborers, but the merchant himself could be a client of an equestrian or aristocrat. Do you see that clients are generally above you? Clients are generally below you. Patrons are above you. And one person, a merchant, can be simultaneously a client to someone else and a patron to someone who's below their social status. But that simultaneous existence of both patron and client does not exist below this level. If you're a manual free person but doing manual labor, you're always a client. Or you're a freed slave, you're always a client. If you're a slave, that's a type of client, but then it is its own separate system. And so really what you're trying to do is be freed, but even then, there's not much freedom in that. So the thing that, so now I want to tight about the language. In a patron-client system, what the client gives to the patron is loyalty. But the Greek word for that is pistis. The Latin word is fides. And in Christian language, we translate this alternatively as faith. So I want you to hear that. The client owes the patron his loyalty or his faith. Why? Because the patron gives favor or charis. We translate this as gift. We translate this as grace. And we also translate this as favor. So to have God, the grace of God is to have God's favor, undeserved favor. That's one way to think about it. But in this system here, the patron grants favors. You need a letter of introduction so that you can start your business. I'll write you a letter to another client of mine. That person will provide the supplies you need to start your business. You need purple dye, I'll get you purple dye. But I want profits, and I want also your loyalty, so that if I go up for office, or if I sponsor the Olympic Games and I need wine and I need entertainers and I need food, I can go to my clients who have those businesses in those areas and say, hey, divvy up, supply. I need to gain honor or dignitas, as our presenter said, by sponsoring the games, and I need you to get to out of the businesses that I gave you that my favor enabled. I now need you to show your loyalty by helping me sponsor these games. So it's very much where the patron exercised charis or favor, and the clients exercised pistis or loyalty. Now, you can see then that these are loaded terms, that if you're talking about, the outsider listening to the Christian system, the outsider. I think what Paul's trying to do is that he's trying to re-educate his population, his congregants, so that typically when they hear the word charis and fides, they don't import into it their definition of it based on how patron system works. He has to redefine these terms for them in many ways. But the outsider listening to Christian discourse might think, well, Jesus must be the patron. Everyone's giving their faith or pistis to him. And who is this Jesus? An alternative emperor or king other than Caesar? This is dangerous. We better take a look at this Christian group, because it's growing. And if it's a threat to the empire, we better shut it down. So there's the primary text, and then ultimately, as they said, Caesar's the ultimate patron. Why? Because the biggest favor he did for the world was he conquered the world, and he brought a peace by the sword that enabled different nations under Roman rule to cooperate with each other. International commerce rose because nations were fighting against each other. They already had a patron, Rome, to whom they owed favor, and so the way one shows favor, loyalty to Caesar, because he provided the Roman peace and enabled an international commercial system to exist when it didn't before. They protected the seaports. The Roman Navy was phenomenal. They stopped they shut it down. They shut down pirating. They created Roman roads where roads didn't exist anymore, and they connected cities. I mean, the Mediterranean area was thriving economically because of what the Roman Empire had accomplished. And what General Aurelius says in a speech to these provinces is, we only demand two things. We want you to pay your taxes, and we want you to participate in emperor worship. Worship the emperor, pay your taxes. That's how you show your loyalty. So in a very telling speech, General Aurelius tells to the provinces of Gaul, there are always kings and wars throughout Gaul until you submitted to our laws. We made life better when you let us conquer you. The only use we have made of our rights as victors has been to impose on you the necessary costs of maintaining the peace. For you cannot secure tranquility among nations without armies, nor maintain armies without pay, nor provide pay without what? Taxes. The moment someone doesn't pay their taxes, that's a declaration of war, and it will invite the vengeance of the Roman Empire on you. Now, what Lampa does, I think, helpfully is, were there examples of good type of patronage being exercised in the church? Well, sort of. What I want to say, patronage is turned into hosts. Those who had wealth, like Stephanus, Titius Eustace, probably Erastus, Gaius, Crispus, there are particular Roman or Greek names mentioned among in Paul's letter to Corinth and his letter to Rome, where these figures probably acted as the hosts for the household, for the house churches. So I think that was a good use of it. If you had means and you could host the house churches meeting, why not? Give of what you have. Phoebe, by the way, was a very prominent benefactor. So she was not only she was mentioned as not only as a minister or pastor of the church, but she also was a benefactor of many people. So she likely sponsored the meeting of the church in her home, as well as was a diakonos or a pastor, minister of it. Lydia was probably hosted the church in Philippi, Jason, Thessalonica, Rufus in Rome, Priscilla and Aquila had noticed that while they joined in Paul's tent making, that's because they were exiled from Rome, and given their very Roman names, they probably were affluent as well. So I'm going to stop here, and because this is where we're going to see that if the church actually getting hammered, or the church experiencing internal problems, and when they let patronage be the primary way they relate to each other. So Erastus, whoever he was, actually probably under the patron system got demoted because he was a Christian. We're going to talk about that a little bit, but we're going to stop here. So in the next, after a break, what we're going to do is we're going to have a break. We're going to talk about where in the New Testament do we see patronage rising up. I listed out in this slide 16 different problems Paul names that's happening in the church, a variety of things. And here's my special effect. It's about as special effects as I get. Of the 16 different things that you see happening in the church that are a problem for Paul, these are pastoral fires that Paul has the kind of put out. It's the problem that's happening over the Lord's Supper, the lack of church discipline over sinning brother in 1 Corinthians 5, and the offense that Paul apparently had toward those who wanted to support Paul's ministry, but he said, I'll be a tent maker and I'll give the gospel free of charge. These three specific concerns is where the church clashes with the patronage system, and there's something to be learned from it that applies to the church today. So when we come back from the break, we're going to particularly examine particularly the Lord's Supper. I think this one's a really good one. We'll briefly talk about these two, but I really want to talk about mostly this one, and then we'll go into our last section with our presentation from the second group. So let's break up. I have it's a little bit past 8:20, so let's have 20 minutes, or let's have 18 minutes. So let's see, 1, 2, 3. So 8:40. So 40 past the hour, wherever you're at, 40 past the hour, let's come back. 40 past the hour. Okay, I think I got everyone back. So something a little bit of fun. So if you were to go to modern day Corinth today, there's a bustling city of Corinth on top of the ancient city. So what you see on screen is an artist's reconstruction of 3% of the city. That means 97% of Corinth is still underground and buried. And unless you can destroy people's homes and kick people out, there's no way to get to the other 97%. So, but we have 3% of the city of Corinth, ancient Corinth, uncovered. And if we were to go there to there, you would the Lachian road or Roman road is really well reconstructed and preserved. But we're going to look at the Erastus inscription. So you go down this valley area, and right here is where the inscription is laid. And this inscription reads, Erastus, in return for his aedileship, laid this pavement at his own expense. So this is a pavement honoring Erastus, who was an aedilus, a magistrate of public works, and in charge of the marketplace, the agora. This is a high-ranking public official in the city of Corinth. Now, what's interesting is that how many high-ranking officials named Erastus do you find in Corinth? Not many, especially when the time period is around the 1st century, when Paul had visited the city and founded the Church of Corinth. So what we know about Erastus is that, and here's where we get a little historical scholarly detective work, and I do think this is right. Some are a little bit more speculative than others, but when good history can be shown, you can make connections between the text of the New Testament, what we know from archaeology and evidence from the 1st century world. And so Erastus is named as a helper with Timothy as co-workers for doing the ministry in the Achaia region, and that included Macedonia and also Corinth and Berea and Thessalonica. In this Erasmus inscription, it seems as if this predates Erasmus mentioned in the letter of Romans and 2 Timothy, where he begins as an aedilus, which is a fairly high-ranking official, especially because he's in charge of the commercial district, the marketplace, the agora. That's his charge. But in Romans 16:23, when Paul says he's writing this letter from Corinth as a letter of introduction to the church in Rome, he mentions Erastus, but his position has changed. Gaius, who's host to me in the whole church, greets you. So does Erastus, the city treasurer. That's a demotion. So the oikonomos was a lower position than the aedilus. In Latin, that would have been the archarius. And our brother Quartus greets you. So one scholar named Moyer, who teaches at Talbot Seminary, which is the seminary of Biola University, he had an interesting discussion in one of the chapters of his book. And he thinks, and I think this is very plausible, that Erastus' faith basically got him in trouble in the patronage system. That it could have been a number of things. Maybe he didn't feel like he could sponsor a religious festival that would have had that, and religion, politics, and the social world, they're blended. So to sponsor a major festival to the gods would be something that a patron would do. And maybe Erastus just felt like he couldn't do that out of his fidelity for Christ. We're not sure. But what is sure is that Erastus chose the church over moving up the patronage ladder or becoming more fluent at the level of patronage that he was in. So it seems as if, though he began as an aedilus in charge of the marketplace, he was reduced to a city treasurer. And in 2 Timothy 4:20, Erastus remained in Corinth. Paul names him as one of the faithful disciples who continued to do the ministry. While Paul was in prison waiting his execution, Erasmus remained in Corinth to continue the work of Paul. So this is one of the things that happens. If you're the church, there are many times where one's commitment to the church might not bring overt physical persecution where you're experiencing violence to the body, but nevertheless, you're experiencing persecution other ways, because all of a sudden, if you don't participate in the religious festival, well then, why am I supplying you the purple dye you need to do your business? You're not cooperating with us, we're not going to cooperate with you. And so there were economic, oftentimes, and social repercussions to non-participation in patronage in order to maintain fidelity to Christ. And Erasmus might have been a clear example of that. But so it costs to choose the church and Christ over the patronage system in the Roman Empire. There's no discipleship without a cost. And so, and here, I'll let you read on your own all the different problems at Corinth, And we're going to revisit these when we talk about some of the ethical sections of our module for New Testament theology. But I'm really focused on the ones that overlap with patronage. So let's go over the minor ones first, because I want to focus on this. There is likely that, so one person named John Chow, a Chinese, I think he's Singaporean. He might be, but he's a Chinese descent, Singaporean of nationality. But he wrote a really wonderful monograph called Patronage and Paul, and he suspects that the brother whom the church failed to discipline, that Paul says, he's in some sort of wrong relationship with the wife of his father. It might not be his biological mother, but the wife of his father. So that means the father has more than one wife. And one of the wives that is not his mother, he's in a relationship with. That kind of thing only happens in affluent families where you're wealthy. Poor usually don't have more than one wife, for example. So he thinks that the church was afraid. They didn't. He was probably a major influential person in the church and a patron. The last thing we wanted to do was to confront him on a sin. And so Paul's saying you can't do that because we're not a patronage system. In Christ, if a sinning brother needs a prophetic challenge, we do it, and that's the most loving thing that we can do. And if he withdraws his political and social favor, that's okay. The church doesn't need it. So 1 Corinthians 5 might be an example where patronage clashes with the church trying to be the church. Another one was that we know for sure the Corinthian church was really offended by two things Paul did. One, he didn't refuse to receive financial support from the church. This is all in 1 Corinthians 9. Paul says, I'm going to give the gospel free of charge. I'm going to work as a tent maker. And that's the second thing that angered them. Because if you look at the patronage pyramid, when you work, you're a free person working with your hands, that's like the only thing that you're higher than is a freed slave, but it's not that good. It's at the bottom of the patronage pyramid. How could we let our leader, our ecclesial leader, Paul, do something as menial as finger-numbing, back-breaking work like making tents? This is hard work. And yet he did it because the church was immature. Was Paul averse to receiving any sorts of financial support? No. He clearly received support from Philippi and other churches, but they were mature. An immature Corinthian church that would lever their financial support of Paul to get favors from him is not a situation Paul wanted to be in. So he refrained from receiving any money from Corinth. He received money from churches like Philippi. He mentions this in 2 Corinthians 8, that out of their poverty they gave, but they were a mature church. They wouldn't treat Paul as a patron and expect to receive favors back. They're not. This is an act of love. So until the church matured, Paul was not going to take a cent from the Corinthians, and that really angered them. So this is another point of patronage that's brought up. So again, we're beginning to see that whatever the patronage system is, Paul does not want that in the church. And the worst thing that happened for Paul was what happened over the Lord's Supper. So I'm going to highlight the part that's in yellow, not read everything, and then summarize. But in 1 Corinthians 11, people are literally dying. They're dropping like flies. Paul's saying this is an act of God's discipline upon the church that's sinning. What is their sin? So when you come together as a church, there are divisions among you. And whatever you're doing, it's not the Lord's Supper. Now, here's the part that people need to kind of figure out what's going on here. You need a good historical structure. Because when you're eating, some of you go ahead and eat with your own private supper. As a result, one person remains hungry, the other gets drunk. Don't you have homes to eat and drink in, or to despise the church of God by humiliating those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you? Certainly not. And then he goes into the Dominical saying that rehearses what the Lord's Supper symbolizes, that Christ died for you. He bled for you. He broke his body for you. That's how much Christ loved the church. And yet some of you are eating and getting drunk. Other people are going away hungry. How is that a reflection of what the Lord's Supper is supposed to represent? So So whoever eats and the bread and drinks the cup, the Lord, in an unworthy manner, it will be guilty of sinning against the body and blood of the Lord. Everyone ought to examine themselves before they eat and drink the cup eat the bread and drink the cup. For those who eat and drink without discerning the body of Christ, eat and drink judgment on themselves. That is why many of you are weak and sick, and a number of you have fallen asleep. And the word falling asleep is a euphemism for they're dead. So somehow, in the same way, Ananias and Sapphira were judged by the Holy Spirit and they dropped dead because God would rather take them home. So they can do less damage control in the church. Some Corinthian believers are dying because they are desecrating the Lord's Supper. So what's going on here? Well, so what we know historically is that if we read Ignatius of Antioch, there's actually the word agape feast mentioned in Jude, but in negative context. And we read other documents like the Didache that tell us very early on how the church did its business. What we'll discover is that prior to the observance of the Lord's Supper, there was something called the agape meal. So Jude is upset because, like in a different circumstance, a different set of churches, the agape meal was being abused and misused in the church. And so he uses the example of Korah's rebellion as an act of God's judgment during these meals, but he actually uses the word agapes, the table of these kind of love things or love feasts. Ignatius of Antioch gives us a lot more detail. The idea is that the church would actually share a meal together. And then after they ate, then they would eat the Lord's Supper together. They observe the Lord's Supper. And the problem is that certain members of the Corinthian church were arriving early. And before everyone could arrive, they were eating the agape meal. And they're eating so well that they got drunk. And they ate so well that nothing was left for the poor, who usually come to the meal late. And then they're going to observe the Lord's Supper, which is supposed to be a testimony that Christ died for us, that the commitment we have to Christ is also reflected in the way we love one another. That's desecrating everything the Lord's Supper symbolizes. And it's almost Paul saying, how dare you do that? And so when you look at so we have some nice archaeology from Corinth. This is collected in Jerome Murphy O'Connor's book called St. Paul's Corinth. And this is a diagram from that book. This is artist reconstruction of a Roman villa where likely a house church might have met. And so most likely that we're not exactly sure, but anywhere between 50 and 100 people can fit in here and call it what we call the impluvium. And there's a separate dining room where people eat. And that's kind of normal, what a normal design for a Roman villa would look like. So if you were to go to Corinth today in the suburbs, you could see this impluvium, or this is an example from Pompeii, which is preserved, but the architecture is the same. So here's the meeting place of the church, 50 to 90 people, artist reconstruction of this home. This would be a separate room, the dining hall. And then when they ate, they would be reclining, and you're always arranged by your social hierarchy. So the host family would be here, the high status guests here, the lower status guests or friends or clients would be further away. Now, what's happening here is this. So in the ancient world, how do you know who your friends are? Okay, now I want to be very careful here. We talked about clients and patrons, but what is the social status of a friend, which was mentioned, I think it was mentioned by presenters, but it's not highlighted in the reading as much, and I definitely want to talk about this more. Long story short, it doesn't matter how much you like a person, your friends in the patron system can only be those in the same social level as you. So if I'm a merchant, I cannot be a friend with a free person, an artisan, someone who's working with their hands. I'm at a higher social level. So in the ancient world, how do you know what your social level was? Because you're mixed. If you go to the marketplace, clients and patrons, everyone's mixed together. Everyone's doing their work. Maybe you can recognize people by the clothing that they wear and the level of affluence. But really, the meals is where the magic is. When you ate, you only ate with your friends. You didn't eat with your clients. You ate with your friends. On occasion, if you're a patron and a client did something exceptional and you wanted to honor them, you might have invited them to one meal and give them a place of honor to reward them. But that was unusual. That was kind of a gift. That was a one-time or two-time thing. It doesn't normally happen. Meals is where the social world saw what social class and the patron system you lived in. You only ate with your friends. And the church was supposed to be different. Regardless of what patronage level you're in, they're supposed to eat together. That's why meals in the book of Acts and the letters of Paul are so important. It didn't matter whether you're Jew or Gentile, slave or free person, male or female, you ate together. And it made a statement. The alternative to the patronage system was Paul's different metaphors for church. Family was a big one for him. The people of God, the elect ones. We're going to talk about in the next section. What does it mean that we're one ethnicity? I mean, that's going to throw a curveball at you, because the word ethnos, usually translated as people or race, First Peter uses that. You're a holy nation, an ethnos. All right, but you could say a holy ethnicity. That the word ethnos is where we get the word ethnicity from. So we're going to talk about the different symbols or metaphors or terms that the churches, that the writers of the New Testament used to describe this phenomenon called church, that the entire world cannot possibly understand how paradigm breaking this was. So they had to draw out every single word from the Greek lexicon to try to describe what the church was. And even then, the sum of those terms was not enough to describe what God was trying to do. So we have what's supposed to happen is the church is supposed to share the meal together. But the problem at Corinth is they kept acting like patrons and clients. And I don't want to be too harsh with them. You live your life one way and you know nothing else. We have to be discipled into relating to each other differently. Paul is doing this discipleship in his letter. But if you read, for example, so Pliny the Younger has this great line where usually your friends eat with you. And even among your friends, there's hierarchies. And then everyone else, your clients, eat in a separate room. So the friends are here. Everyone see that on the screen? The clients are here. And then Pliny has a line. You bring the best wine, the best food here. And then it literally says, it's not quite here. You bring the leftover food to the leftover people over here. That's what the church was doing. And some of them were getting sick and dying. And Paul saw that as God's judgment on the church. And he's saying, you cannot relate to each other this way and then eat the Lord's Supper. Because the Lord's Supper said, Christ died for that brother. Christ died for that sister. His blood was spilled. His body was broken. And you're going to treat them as if they're second-class citizens. You're going to stick them in another room. You're going to gorge yourself on the best food. You're going to give them the leftovers. And some of them are going to go away hungry because they get to the meal too late. And you call that the church? No way. Paul is mad. And he evokes something that all of us should understand. For I received from the Lord what I also passed on to you. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread. And he given thanks, and he broke it and said, this is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same way, after the supper, he took the cup, saying, "This is the cup of the new covenant in my blood, my blood. Do this whenever you drink of it in remembrance of me. For whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." The church has to be a visible witness of the kind of sacrificial death that Christ gave for the entire world. And it's failing, absolutely failing here, because they're bringing the patronage system into the church. So, and then and just to bring this into a New Testament theology, in Luke 2, listen, Jesus actually mentions the word patron. Okay, he says, the kings of the Gentiles, Lord, how do they relate to each other? They lord it over them. They lord their authority. They exercise authority over them, and they call themselves benefactors or patrons. But you are not to be like that. You are not to be like benefactors and patrons. No way. Instead, the greatest among you should be the youngest, the one who rules like the one who serves. And who is greater, the one who sits at the table, being favored by the client, or the one who serves? Is it not the one who sits at the table out there in the world? But I'm telling you, here among God's people, I'm among you who serves. I'm among the slaves. Jesus called them and said, you know the rules, and Gentiles and high officials exercise authority over them. But whoever wants to become great among you must become your servant. Whoever wants to be first must be your slave. For the Son of Man did not come in to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Jesus identified himself not at the top of the pyramid, but at the bottom. And he specifically says, don't be like the benefactors and patrons. Don't relate to each other that way. Paul, now I want to be very careful here. I want to talk about his metaphorical use of slavery and the social institution of slavery. It's really important you don't confuse these two. When Paul says I'm a slave of Christ, he's not condoning slavery as a system. What he's doing is he's flipping the patronage pyramid upside down. Jesus himself identified himself as someone who gave his life as a ransom for many. I've made myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. I identify myself at the bottom. Even though Paul was an aristocrat, he had an elitist Roman education at Tarsus. He could have claimed the top. He chose the bottom because that's what Jesus did. Now, but that's not an endorsement of the slavery as an institution, because when it comes to the social institution of slavery, he says in 1 Corinthians 7, if you can gain your freedom, do it. Do it. But know this, whether you're in the slave system of Rome or outside the slave system, it doesn't matter. That's not what defines you. For whoever were slaves when they're called into faith are the Lord's free men. If you're institutionally a slave, you're free in Christ. And those of you who are free when you were called became Christ's slaves. You were bought at a price. Do not be claimed as slaves of human beings. Instead, serve one another. This is an idea of mutual love, mutual submission, mutual belonging to each other. And so, again, I'm not going to go over it in detail, but all I want to say is that when the letter to Philippians, when Paul could leverage patronage or his privilege to Philemon and force him to do what he called the right thing, Spike Lee's famous movie, Do the Right Thing, I'm going to borrow that title. Paul tells Philemon do the right thing, but doesn't force it. In fact, he tries instead to model something different for Philemon. He says that I have the authority to order you to release Philemon, but I rather appeal to you on the basis of love and have you make that decision. And so I'm just not gonna, all I'm gonna say is that Paul uses economic metaphors to bring value to the life of Onesimus. He's saying, isn't it better not to have him as a slave, but to receive him as a beloved brother? That's more valuable. And both in the flesh, in the Lord. And this is where I think Paul gets really explicit. I know what it means to be brother in the Lord. That's a Christian. What does it mean to be a brother in the flesh? That's literally the language here, and sarkos, and sarki. And I'm thinking, he must mean free Onesimus, because that's what a brother, if you're going to be a brother in the flesh, in the real world, in the flesh, then I think he's saying free him. And so that his status in your household matches his status in the Lord. But there's arguments here about how to interpret this. But I think the key thing here is that Paul's trying to model in the church, at least in the church, in the Christian household, where there might be a mixed faith, some are believers, outside believers, so, and the patron might not be the believer, it might be the unbeliever. You're gonna have some difficulties, so it's not as clear in his injunctions to instructions in the household, but clearly in the church, it's supposed to be a different reality. And so what I want to then end with, because I want to give time for the last group to at least present, and we'll have to follow up, is that when Paul, he transformed static vertical relationships into what Lampa calls symmetrical models. Is there no hierarchy in the church? There is a hierarchy, but it's not based on, let me say this very carefully. There's a hierarchy in the church. There's leadership in the church. It's not based on male or female. You don't privilege males or females or vice versa. It's not slave or free, not the patron system. It's not Jew or Gentile. It's not based on nationalism. It's based on spiritual maturity. There are leaders or shepherds in the church, but what prevents that from being oppressive, it's because it's a servant type of leadership. We exercise our leadership by not being served, but serving and become a ransom for many. Paul identified himself with the lower end of the patronage period, not the higher end. So did Jesus. So we talk about, so it's the model is mutual respect. A more radical way of talking about it is mutually submitting to each other. In other words, if I submit to myself, I give up my rights to love someone, but the other person doesn't give up their rights to love me. That's not very symmetrical. That can turn abusive really fast. The ideal of the church is that I'm laying down my life for my brother and sister, but they're also laying down their life for me. And if everyone participates in a system where none of us are patrons, instead we take on the role of the servant, the church can be what it should be. A very powerful testimony of God's love in the world and a way to relate to each other that mirrors the reality of God's love for the world. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to pause. I'm going to let the other. So I think what we have is an opportunity for our presenting group to present fully, and then we'll have to pick up next week, and that's okay, because if you look at the calendar, next week we only have one presenter, and it's kind of like 75% of a full module. I left room so that we could spill into the next session, but I want to give our presenters time to present. But any quick question about what was shared? I blitzed through that, but I want people to see that I think clearly the New Testament witness is the church should be antithetical to the patronage system. Yeah. And both Jesus and Paul are united in their testimony against being a benefactor in a wrong sort of way, leveraging power for loyalty. Instead, benefactors might have hosted churches, they gave freely, but it would be more like a free will offering than it would be for levering privilege or favor. All right, the big question is what happened at Corinth of the Lord's Supper? Is that happening today in our churches? Man, if it is, we're in trouble. Maybe we don't take it seriously because God in his mercy, we're not dropping dead like flies like they did in Corinth.
I have a quick question before
Yeah.
our presenters.
Yeah.
Do we have any way of knowing like what this looked like outside of the early church? Like if they all ate at the table together at church, what did that look like for them outside of that time together? Because if this is what like their social system was built on,
yeah,
what God is calling us to and calling them to is bigger than just that time together. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
I think that we're guilty of that today. Like,
well, I think the idea though is that the church would be kind of a public event. Worship service is public, so people would have seen that. So you invited outsiders to join the church, and the thing is that the structures of life outside the church weren't conducive for this kind of table fellowship. But I'm sure that They treated each other as brothers and sisters in the Lord. They might have even broke some of the social norms and ate together. I think it's very possible, but it's a little bit, we're not sure, but certainly within the church, you slam the door on patronage and you do something else. That's what Paul wanted. And what was happening in Corinth, but not necessarily the other churches. I think Paul had a lot of really good things to say about how the churches love one another, that people are hearing it. He says your faith and your love is being heard by all the churches in Judea and other places. So there are clearly churches that are living into this reality, but at least in Corinth, we have a really immature young church that doesn't know what they're doing, and Paul's discipling them into a new reality. And I mean, this is pastorship 101. This is what we want to do, right? So for me, rather than being scandalized by the failure of the Corinthian church, I'm more interested in is how Paul is discipling them out of it, which is our task pastorally. All right. I'm going to pass the baton. So other presenters, you have a full 20 minutes. So please present. Let's hear what you have to say. And then you probably leave us with controversy, and then we'll have to settle that next week.
Thanks, Professor Lee. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. All right. Sorry, one second. Can you guys all see this? Yes. Okay. All right. So we're going to talk about constructing ethnic identity in 1 Peter, who you are no longer. And this was written by Jeanette Oak. And this verse is 1 Peter 2:9. So she's taken apart 1 Peter, and this verse has been a personally important verse for me as I have been wrestling with how my own ethnic identity intersects with our identity as Christians. And so Jeanette Oak uses 1 Peter to construct a Christian identity in terms of an ethnic identity in her book. So Oak says that, and I think this is the main point of our reading, is that she argues that the author of 1 Peter constructs Christian identity as an ethnic identity by using ethnic language and an early form of ethnic reasoning. So she juxtaposes Anthony D. Smith's characteristics of ethnic identity with, is it Herodotus? Okay, Herodotus's 4 markers of Greekness. And then she kind of uses this definition of ethnic identity, which is defined as a sense of peoplehood that arises from putative claims of shared blood, common language, shared religious practice, and shared customs. And that kind of lays down the foundation for her points. And so in 1 Peter, she basically is saying that the first part of that is she's establishing that God is the Father, is like for the Gentiles, that God is their Father. And this is done through election, new birth, and through, most emphatically, through the blood of Jesus Christ. And then the second thing is that they need to live out their new culture, which is marked by obedience and holiness. So as obedient children, she says, and that they have a heavenly homeland. And that reminded me of what Paul said in Philippians 3:20, that he's saying, oh, our citizenship is actually in heaven. So it's not necessarily a physical place. And the rooting of that, the rooting of the Christian identity by the way it is lived out by following the example of Jesus Christ. So that's part of that Christian identity. And then there's the communal identification, which is really important. And basically she's saying that 1 Peter is borrowing from Israel's identity defining designations, and it gives this communal communal identification to make sense of their suffering, of the Gentile suffering. Some of the key elements that she points out for the audience, or what she refers to as the addressees of First Peter, are that they're chosen and liberated. And I think this part is really important. She keeps really repeating herself on the fact that because of Christ, there's a shared descent. But it was also important to note that we have been chosen with the foreknowledge of God the Father. Like that was really, that was an important thing to note, that there was this choosing that was happen like beforehand. And that this fatherhood of God was always in relation to Jesus and not just to Israel. So not so much that it was father of Israel, but it was in relation to Jesus. And then that they were liberated. So she kind of goes into how when there were slaves, that they could be paid, and they could be purchased and then be set free. And so essentially she's saying that it's as if God paid this and purchased us, and therefore liberated us. And then that First Peter 1:18-19, it basically alludes to Christ's blood. That was the purchase price, and it liberates us from the past and transforms our new lives, which equates to the new birth. And she also points out the importance in the times of the that the Gentiles were living in, of how patrilineal ideology was important. So blood relations were authoritative in determining one's worth, and it legitimized identity. And so in that patrilineal ideology, we are the children of God, and as children of God, we don't just belong to God, but we also belong to each other. And it gave them a way to live in the world without compromise. And she uses this ethnic language because it helps to shape the Christian identity and self-understanding as to who we are as God's people, at least for the Gentiles that she's talking about here. And that's really important because it gives strength to kind of her argument, and it gives strength to the understanding and the self-understanding that the Gentiles would have of what the author of First Peter was trying to say. And that it was creating this new culture. And basically she defines this culture as a way of life, of values and conduct, and that's closely related and tied in with ethnic identity, and always looking to the example of Christ. And finally, she gives the theological and sociological lens, or that's what she is saying that First Peter is basically doing. And it's that lens that the Gentiles are going to use to interpret their own suffering and be able to endure it. And so it gives this nice framework as to who we are and how we ought to live as believers. And then I'm going to give it to Julie.
So as she moves to the conclusion, she develops this idea of a collective identity, which she calls a distinct identity. And so starts to kind of bring these ideas back together, and what that identity can be found in three ways. We chose the words boundaries, belonging, and biological markers. And so the boundaries are the ethnic formation that occurs not in isolation from the outsiders, but through social context. But Peter's creating an in-group identity for the people. So there's that balance between the two. The belonging is back to that belief in the common ancestry, a shared ethno-religious identity now that has come to them through Paul, and reiterates this idea of part of the belonging is through obedience and holiness. Biological markers were that idea that we have a shared patrilineage through Father God, through the blood of Jesus Christ, and the hope with the hope that they understand themselves as a possession of a distinct, honored ethnic identity that cannot be denied, renounced, or hidden. They're a new people, and they're changed, and they have a new birth. And then through that, as we come to this modern idea, the prejudice comes up, and that ever-present threat for people of color about that this identity should help them combat the Gentiles were combating being a part of the culture. And Mario will talk about this a little bit more, but this idea that this can be a way for people in these communities to address this in the modern culture. So our strengths and weaknesses. Very strong sense of identity in Christ because of Christ's blood. She talked about that a lot and using languages familiar to us. We thought it was well organized in that she very clearly set out what she was going to prove and her guidelines for that. As she came to each section, she'd kind of reiterate what she had said in the previous section. That being said, there did seem to be a lot of redundancy. So some of the themes that came up often, the election, obedience, the idea that they were diaspora people, it seemed to be that she readdressed that quite often. The new identity and building a strong sense of the new community to give Gentiles a strong footing in the face of the hardships and prejudice. So one of the things she says that Peter was trying to do was set them well in a difficult situation. She addresses this weakness herself, the perpetual foreigner comparison, and how this can be interpreted by those of the Asian American community who look at themselves a little differently, and other groups of the BIPOC groups. And then, of course, we've heard this on some of the other ones. There was a lot of Greek. And at times she gave us the background. At other times she didn't, but I found as a non-Greek reader, it would slow me down, and I'd have to go back and try to figure out what it meant and try to use context and look at the passage. And so sometimes I would lose my train of thought. So it was complicated for me as a non-Greek reader. So our implications. Some of us don't focus, our ministry is focused on youth and children, so we decided we should put a few implications in related to that. So what is our identity? For students who are searching for their identity, we can help them see how First Peter constructs these ideas of identity and belonging, that they're more than their school, their social group, their family, but they're part of a bigger group. For younger children, this idea of creating belonging. Where do we belong? Who do we belong to? For children, the sense of belonging is one of the things that is identified as an important thing in faith formation. So they need to experience that they are part of the beloved community of the church. And I'm going to pass it off to Mario.
Thank you so much. And so are we started? Okay. In terms of solidarity, can you all hear me pretty well? How about now? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Great. Okay. So in terms of solidarity, talks about communal identity and thinking beyond individualism. This could also lead to helping us understand solidarity as well as being incarnational as Jesus was. No big eyes, no little U's, that type of deal, coming together. And then the writer talks about elitism and caution for new race, right? So we must be careful about how we view the new race of Christianity and need to be careful that we don't build ourselves in isolation or view ourselves as better than. And so the thought comes to mind when I think about some of these groups that consider themselves Christians. I can't think of it. It's one particular group, the group that really supports Trump. What is it? Christian. I should have wrote it down, but I can't call the group right now. But it's like a white. I can't think of the group. I should have wrote it down. I'm sorry, you all. So, but we basically can't think of ourselves as elitists, as being better than someone else. And when we talk about a new race, are we talking about ethnicity? So we can't think of ourselves, although we're Christians and believers, we can't think of ourselves in terms of being better than other people because we're all God's creation, regardless of what you believe. And so that's very important. And then, so how does it get translated from ancient times to today? That's a very something thought provoking. We need to think through those things. And I'll go to the next one. Something to consider: perpetual foreigner. How does this translate for Asian American Christians who are considered and think of themselves or experience the world as perpetual foreigners? And so this is a deep thought, because this also helps me to do some self introspection. Helps me to think of me as being an African American person, an African American male in America. That you, so to me, it's like you're doubly isolated to some degree, because you really don't fit, because you're in a place that's not your natural place. Africa is, but at the same token, you're here now. And on top of that, now you're a Christian, you're a believer, and you're thinking of other things too. You have this new thought. So the one thing that bridges the gap for all of us is Jesus. Is that bridges the gap for us. It gives us a new language. And so, and it talks about this is a point of relation, but it also can be a discouragement in being a foreigner, right? If we are in context of majority cultures in our churches, denominations, and communities. When we consider that our citizenship is elsewhere, does it bring relief and relatability, or does it conjure anxiety or disconnectedness? How does it feel when you're the majority or the minority in a particular church and things like that? So we ought to consider these particular things. And our next point is BIPOC and other marginalized groups. How are other groups impacted by this? And does this mean we erase our own ethnic identities in order to embrace the Christian one? How do we hold both and still stay faithful? How do we fully embrace ourselves and our cultures with this new identity? So some people think that they have to get rid of, when it talks about how do we hold both and still stay faithful, get rid of who they are at the core. That's not necessarily true, right? So I believe the inner building of Christ, he's continually perfecting us unto the day of Jesus Christ, right? So he's actually helping us, he's recreating us within who we are already. And so you think about Paul, right? Paul didn't necessarily change who he was in terms of his communication style, and he didn't forget everything all of a sudden. He just allowed the gospel to permeate through him and his expression into who he already was as a person. He didn't totally change in that degree where he was unrelatable. And so he was himself. And so, to be honest with you, the thing that I like most about North Park is so many different people, and everybody loves Jesus. And the common factor is everybody loves Jesus, but everybody has a different way of communicating that message. And so, that's my tangent. I'll leave it there. Okay, because there's a lot more I can say, but I'm at 9:30, so I don't want to go past that point. And we'll leave it up to the questions, if that's all, Phyllis.
Yep, that's it. So I'll stop the share.
Okay.
You're muted, Max.
You're muted, Max.
Yeah, thank you. I am muted. Okay, so I'm off mute now. So we ran out of time. So thank you, presenters. There's a lot of questions I want to keep ask. I think we have to mine into this reading a little bit more. But just to trace the contours of what the presenters shared and kind of set us up for a really good discussion when we get back. So I mean, what Oak has done, I think that's been amazing, is that she's done a lot of historical work on what constitutes an ancient ethnicity. So not modern categories of race, not modern ideas of ethnicity. How did a person in Paul and Jesus understand ethnicity? And then what is the First Peter doing with that ethnic language? Whenever you see the word in your English translation as like a holy nation or Gentile or people, that could be the word ethnos in Greek. And the one thing that they don't translate it as a new ethnicity, but if you use the word ethnicity and understand it as an ancient category, not a modern one, it's quite radical that while there's a lot of different metaphors for the church, family of God, body of Christ, that we would actually be a new ethnicity. And that's on top of that, what's happening is that terms that usually define Israel, only Israel, are now being reapplied to the Gentile community. What does that mean then, that Gentiles are considered part of Israel? And so these are some of the questions that we had to unpack, because there's a danger to this language if removed from its context of persecution. The context is persecution. The outside world has rejected you. So in that context, these are diaspora Gentile communities that are marginalized, and the language of being a new ethnic group that shares an ethnic heritage, a mythic heritage, a lineage with the Jewish people, so that their stories are adopted into ours. That's going to be important for the Gentile communities and their new identity. So what I wanted to kind of just kind of highlight really quickly is that we're going to talk, because I won't share the screen. We're going to come back and we're going to talk about the implications of Oak's work. And what she doesn't want to say when you read the conclusion is it doesn't turn into a colorless Christianity. We're not aiming for one super race where there's no color. That's not how the ethnic language is being used in the Petrine letters. And so we have to ask, how is the new ethnic language or the people of God, including Gentiles, as a new ethnicity or one ethnicity helpful? And in what ways could it be misappropriated by the modern reader, apart from the intent of what the New Testament writer wanted to do with that language? I think that's what we have to divide up, because I think the New Testament celebrates the diversity of ethnic culture as being a part of what the church is, and to erase ethnic identity in order to be one people of God is not what the New Testament is talking about. But I've heard way too many times from other preaching and teaching that that's what they think the New Testament is doing, and it's not. So these are the kind of issues that are waiting. It's a perfect introduction to ecclesiology in the next section on baptism, discipleship, and what the church is. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing, and we're going to end. Good night, everyone. I want to ask that Group C, Rachel, Michael, who's not here, but and he told me why, Kathleen and Michelle, could we just talk a little bit about your presentation next week? So presentation Group C remains. Everyone else exit and have a great week.